Hi everyone, welcome to Tuesdays with Teresa, and today's topic is understanding and revelation. We'll go into this topic even more deeply as the months progress because the concept of understanding is very important to Teresa personally, and it's also a way she's incredibly gifted. So to offer you a little bit of context for starting our discussion, I thought I would share with you one of her small books or writings entitled The Meditation on the Song of Songs. But before I even get into the meditation on the Song of Songs, which will probably need to happen another week, I want to lay the groundwork. Because for Teresa, to understand, while it's, yes, a cognitive function, she's all about using the mind, it's also a perceiving, and it's also a direct experience that lets us become more whole, and in her language, lets us grow in our union with God. So if you look at the word understanding, it connotes a grasping of something, a grasping of knowledge in some way, or it could be other things other than knowledge. And if you look at revelation, there's something of the unknown coming into being known. So there can be a bit of a paradox there, right? Understanding and revelation. And when we look at faith, especially in her day and age in the 1500s, faith was seen as something that would be a blind obedience. Now, she does not deny that giving your whole surrender to that which is beyond you is paramount in personal growth and spirituality. She does not deny that. She believes it wholeheartedly. But her sophisticated way of how we grow in understanding and the inner confidence and freedom that comes from that is very important to note. Because it was during a time of, if you're familiar with history at all, of the Council of Trent and the Spanish Inquisition. So let me give you a lay of the land, especially when it comes into her meditation on the Song of Songs. Now, if you're not familiar, the Song of Songs is a Hebrew text. Some scholars would say it is the Song of Solomon, and it was written as a poetic celebration of the love between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether that's true or not, we do know that it happened somewhere around that historical time, and that ultimately it's a metaphor for the love affair between the Creator and creation. It's this beautiful dance in a book called The 10 Cosmic Powers, a tantric text. Chapter 3 is the Tripura Sundari, which is the divine desiring. And it is the consciousness that is ineffable, celebrating the dance with the consciousness that's in form. And the desire is union, not just of the form or the created with the ineffable, but ultimately the desire of the ineffable's longing to be fully known in what's created. I know that's a little heady and a little wordy, but her understanding and experience is very, very similar to that. So let me give you some context for the Song of Songs, because while it's a major theme in her own life, she doesn't always speak directly to that part of what the love affair of union with God is. As many of you probably know, in anywhere from the 1200s up to the 1500s, Christianity was beginning, because of its globalization, to take lots of different forms, lots of different searches. And while Christianity was still housed largely under what would be considered a Roman Catholic hierarchy, aside from the Eastern Orthodox, which split off in 1098, I believe, AD. But largely it's still housed under this centrality. Well, that begins to fracture because, structurally speaking, it can't support the nature of the experiment we call of being faithful and having union with God, all the theologies and all the practices just didn't fit in all the different cultures. And of course, the human species is going through many changes too. Well, Teresa is living in the time when Martin Luther became a celebrity. It started out with his theses that he posted on the chapel doors. I think it might have been of his local chapter. And it was not a way of standing against something, though he did have strong convictions. It was a Socratic method to invite dialogue about the relevance of the theology and spirituality. Ultimately, there was a deep fracture that has resulted in the Lutheran tradition. And this was happening left and right, and it grieved Teresa's heart greatly because she's a woman of her times. She doesn't have internet the way we have it today. She doesn't understand the real nature of what's happening. She doesn't have communications with everyone involved. She lives in Spain, which is separated by the mountains, and she acts only on the information that's given to her. She's such a great testament that we can be a mystic. We can come into a true awakening right within the limitations of our own cultural setup. If we look back at some of the things she purports to be true, we would say, well, that's not really true at all. Some of the fears she has around hell, we would hold a very different view. And it could lead us to doubt the merit of her mystical contribution. But I think the opposite is true. It shows her approachability, to be so human and so affected and want harmony among all instead of greater division. So at the time then, the Bible first put forward to be translated in the vernacular by Luther, and then of course it spreads to lots of different Christian communities, and there's big dispute in Catholicism, should the Bible be in the vernacular, which means in the language of the people. High opposition from the hierarchy, thinking that uneducated people would misuse the word. Talk about power struggles and power plays. But the vernacular is still coming out. Many mystics, right within the Catholic tradition, are translating it so that those they're in contact with can have their own experience of the words and the interpretation that they would come to. Well, in the Spanish indexes, that would be lists of the rights and the wrongs that are defined by the hierarchy. Bible translations in the language of the people were strictly forbidden. And this was not a light law. In fact, a friend of hers, Louis de Leon, he had translated the Song of Songs twice into vernacular. And it was the very source of the charges against him during the Inquisition, for which he was imprisoned terribly for 4 whole years. He was imprisoned for 4 years for translating a text into the language of the people. So it gives you a sense of what she's dealing with when she is drawing inspiration from the very text that inform her own life. She wasn't allowed to have access as a Carmelite nun and as a leader of a community to even see them in her own language. It's not to say that she didn't get a hold of copies, and it's not to say that there weren't ways she was able to speak to various male leaders and get translations, even if they were only verbal articulations. So it's not to say she was completely bereft of anything in her language. But what is important to note is that she points out that as she prays the words in the language of Latin, a language that she has light familiarity with because she's chanting in Latin a lot through the day, but she doesn't speak it, that she has a direct experience of understanding, even though her mind didn't know the language. And so she softens this boundary between what it means to understand and what it means to experience revelation. She comments, and I'm going to read this quote for you in relation to the Song of Songs. For a number of years now, the Lord has given me great delight each time I hear or read some words from the Song of Songs. The delight is so great that without understanding the vernacular meaning, my soul is stirred and recollected more than by devotional books written in the language I understand. And this happens almost all the time. Even when the Latin words were translated for me into the vernacular, I did not understand the text any more. She means any more than the direct experience. What she gives witness to is a concept that's popular today. In fact, I'm drawing the concept from Barbara Brennan's work from In Hands of Light. And she comments, Barbara does, that intelligence is a field and that we're part of that field. And intelligence is not only an understanding with the mind, but it's the mind, heart, body, and soul fully alive into a knowing. Teresa had this experience. Deprived of words that her mind could chew on, she had experience that illumined her mind. As a contemplative, Teresa's pretty amazing, because you think of contemplative, and I don't know about you, but as a contemplative myself, I oftentimes think of just being absorbed into presence for long periods of time. And sometimes our faculties go along with that, don't they? Sometimes they quiet themselves into the whole experience, and we can feel even on a cellular level that there is this union and harmony and oneness. And other times, our faculties don't cooperate. Maybe our emotions are running so strong we're disassociated from that rest and presence. Maybe our mind is trying to figure out things with such vehemence and devotion that we find ourselves rolling out on distracted thought instead of resting into. Well, Teresa doesn't want us to try to quiet our minds. What she wants us to do is to simply work to harness the mind into the direct focus that allows the spaciousness of being one with the intelligence of the field. And she shows by her experience of the illumination in inspired texts, not even in her own language, that the more we can do that we focus in our cognition, not by trying to suspend it, but by trying to point it so directly towards the practice of understanding what's before us, that we create a spaciousness that lets the intelligence come to us, that bridges the understanding and revelation that can seem like a paradox into one experience from which we come forward changed. We have a knowing that goes far beyond the knowing that can be a mechanical or analytical approach. She's brilliant that way. And all the mystics teach us by their lives that that's the true path of understanding, that contemplation leads us to understand the world around us, leads us to understand the nature of our own history, leads us to embody our individuality in a strong, confident, free way. Even though she practices great obedience to the hierarchy, anytime she's told to do anything, even when she has written different texts and she was told to burn them, she'll throw them right into a fire. She has no attachment in those ways. Even though she practices that, do you know where she relies or what she leans into for her wisdom, for her confidence, for her true understanding? Her direct experience. And she invites you and me to trust our experience to the degree that the experience itself can reveal what is meant to be known or understood. Now, in the Song of Songs, it begins so lusciously. It starts out with this, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Your love is sweeter than wine." And it starts out very luxuriously. And she points out in the beginning of her treatise on the meditation of the Song of Songs that she sees this as a call to each one of us. So perhaps your path, you wouldn't speak of it in the nature of it being a love affair, of being pursued by a beloved, or of being the lover yourself. Perhaps you wouldn't use that language. But metaphorically, she uses that language to show us that we are ever meant to have a juicy, juicy life. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. She wants to be kissed right on the lips. So in other weeks, we're going to talk more about the nature of understanding, because she's very strong that as opening up to ecstatic experience, it's important to work with our minds. And then we're also going to get into some of her juicy interpretation of the Song of Songs. Now, I have a funny story for you. When I was in the monastery, it was interesting because we lived a very liturgical life. So we were singing and meditating on and reciting words of inspired texts, and in particular the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, hours each day. Once a day we would have liturgy where a priest led. And I noticed through the years and years of liturgy that the readings are all chosen to fit the season. So you open up the lectionary to a point, and then there are designated readings that are there. And sometimes they give alternates to those readings. Every time a passage of the Song of Songs was put there to be a first reading or a second reading, every single time there would be an alternate text. And every time a priest was officiating, he chose the alternate text, showing how uncomfortable he was and our culture was with contemplating what it might mean to have a love affair that God is kissing us tenderly and passionately on the lips. So she gives us an invitation to know that we're meant to have that kind of kiss in life. And we're meant to have our minds caught up, because the intelligence of the field is that in which we live and move and have our being. We're meant to be delighted with our thoughts, with our feelings, with every part of our bodies. She gives good witness to that. Isn't that wonderful? And she lived, close to 600 years ago. So she has some good lessons for us who live still in a predominantly puritanical culture. So I hope you enjoyed that little tidbit on Teresa. Have a fantastic day. It's great to be with you. Blessings. Mwah.